Hello. In this tutorial, we are going to learn about how to handle errors and exceptions in Python. By the end of this video, you will have a solid understanding of how to handle errors and exceptions in Python and would be able to implement the coding challenge at the end of this video. Let's get started. Before we dive into error handling, let's first talk about what errors and exceptions are. An error is a problem that occurs when a program is running, such as a syntax error or a semantic error. An exception is a specific kind of error that is raised when something unexpected happens, such as trying to divide by 0 or trying to access an index that doesn't exist in a list. Now let's see how to handle the exceptions. The most common way to handle exceptions in Python is by using a try except block. A try block is used to enclose the code that might raise an exception, and an except block is used to handle the raised exception. Here is a simple example. In this example, we use a try block to enclose the code that might raise an exception by executing divide 1 by 0. We then use an except block to handle the 0 division error exception that might be raised and print an error message. The 0 division error is a specific type of exception. We also might use a general one such as exception. Let's run this piece of code. In addition to the try except block, you can also use a finally block. The code in a finally block will always be executed regardless of whether an exception was raised or not. This is useful for cleaning up resources or closing files. Here is an example. In this example, we use a try block to enclose the code that might raise an exception, which is dividing 1 by 0. We then use an except block to handle the 0 division error exception that might be raised and print an error message. And finally, we use the finally block to print a message that will always execute. Let's run this piece of code and see what it prints. And as you see, the print inside the try block is executed and the finally block is also executed. There are several common types of exceptions that you can use in your code, such as value error, file not found error, not implemented error, exception, and so on. So far we have learned how to handle exceptions, but you can also raise your own exceptions. You can use the raise keyword to raise an exception. Here is an example. In this example, we define a function called divide that takes in two arguments, x and y. We then check if y is equal to 0, and if it is, we use the raise keyword to raise a value error exception with the message cannot divide by 0. This allows us to handle the exception in a more controlled and specific way rather than just letting the program crash. Let's run the program. As you see, our specific error message has been printed here. Another way to handle errors and exceptions in Python is by using the assert statement. An assert statement is used to check if a given condition is true, and if it's not, it raises an assertion error. Here is an example. In this example, we assert that x should be greater than 0, and if it's not, we raise an assertion error with the message x should be positive. This is a useful way to check for preconditions and postconditions in your code. Now let's run the code. And as you can see, the assertion has raised here. Coding challenge. Suppose in a social media post, you ask a question like, what is your lucky number? People are commenting their number in either digit format or in words. You have a dictionary of all these response comments in string type associated with the usernames. For example, user 1 commented 1, user 2 commented word 2, user 3 commented digit 3, and so on. Write a class that gets the dictionary as its property in the init function. Then define a function in the class to go over the dictionary, parse the numbers to integer, and identify the users whose number is divisible by 7. From the alphabetic numbers, your application only considers numbers equal to 7. Then you need to call the function in the main body of the application. I also encourage you to change the application to read the user responses from a CSV file and insert them to a dictionary. With a dictionary like this one, your output should look like this, which reports user 5 and user 6. First, I define a class. I call it my class, and inside the class I define init function, and the argument of the init function is numbers as dictionary. I assign it to self.numbers. Then I define the function check even numbers. In this function I define an empty list, 7 numbers, and then in the for loop I go over the items in the numbers dictionary. Inside the for loop I define try and except block. Inside the try I want to cast the number into integer and then divide it by 7. So if this condition is true, then I append that user to my 7 numbers. For the alphabetic numbers, we get exception, and inside the exception we check the lower characters of the number. If it equals 7, then we append that user to the 7 numbers, and finally we return the 7 numbers list. And here we define the numbers as the dictionary, and then define an instance of the my class and pass the numbers as the argument of the class, and then call the function check even numbers and print the output. And let's run it again, and you see the user 5 and user 6 are those with the lucky numbers of 7. So we have learned what the errors and exceptions are, try except blocks in Python, how to raise your own exception, and how to use the assert statement. Remember that it's important to handle exceptions correctly to prevent your program from crashing and to make your code more readable and maintainable. In the next video, I'm going to teach the basics of data visualization in Python. Thanks for watching and see you in the next lecture.